and welcome to Penguin Classics On Air. This is Elda Rotor, editorial director of Penguin Classics. Today's program is called Sholem Aleichem, Yiddish Classics by the creator of Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. You may not recognize the name Sholem Aleichem, but many listeners know his beloved Jewish character Tevye and the familiar lines from Fiddler on the Roof. If I were a rich man, yah-deedle-deedle, bubba-bubba-deedle-deedle-dum. For this program, John Siciliano, our Penguin Classics editor, interviews Aliza Shevrin, the translator of Tevye the Dairyman, and Motl, the Cantor's son, our first ever Yiddish classics for Penguin, by the most beloved writer in Yiddish literature, who has been called the Jewish Mark Twain. So stay with us for John's talk with Aliza on Sholem Aleichem.
Let's talk about Sholem Aleichem. We've just published your new translation of Tevye the Dairyman in one volume with Motl, the Cantor's son. These, of course, are Sholem Aleichem's most famous works, and we've published them for the 150th anniversary of Sholem Aleichem's birth. So just to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about Sholem Aleichem the man and also about his name?
Of course, Sholem Aleichem is a pseudonym. His real name was Solomon Rabinovich or Sholem Rabinovich, either way. But in those days, many of the writers, especially writers of Yiddish, used a pseudonym because they didn't know how successful their works would be. They didn't know if they would get into trouble with their own names. So many of them had pseudonyms that almost always mirrored the kind of people they were. So this other writer, Mendele Mochus Forum, that was his pseudonym, and it meant Mendele, the seller of books. Sholem Aleichem, which is used all the time among Jews, means peace to you, and is used all the time as hi there, hello, or goodbye. So when you come into a room, you say, Sholem Aleichem, and the other people or persons answers backwards, Aleichem Sholem, peace to you, and then the answer is to you, peace, and that is the greeting. There is no one word for hello or goodbye. It's always Sholem Aleichem.
When people say Sholem Aleichem, does the person they're talking to think that they mean the writer, or do they think they mean hello?
It's the writer. It's the people like myself who work with his stuff. Most people haven't the vaguest idea.
So, and this is a Yiddish term.
Yes, Yiddish, or it's in Hebrew too. It's spoken in Israel as well.
Now, would it be recognized in Russia, for example, or any of the? Because Sholem Aleichem, of course, was Russian.
Yes, he was. Maybe Jews in Russia might say that, but not likely.
Now, Sholem Aleichem was. Tell me about when he was born and where he was born, and just to give us a little outline of where his life took him.
Yeah, he was born in 1854 in a small town called Pereyaslav, which is about 10-15 miles outside of Kiev. And actually, I visited his birthplace. It's been made into a sort of a shrine now. It had a dirt floor, very basic, small, little writing desk, a couple of beds. Poor. He was poor. His mother died when he was quite young, and he was one of 6 children at that time. His father remarried another woman who also had 6 children of her own, so 12 children were raised either there or something like it. And it was a tough life. The stepmother was sort of like Cinderella. She was a mean stepmother and preferred her own children. And Sholem Aleichem and his siblings sort of got leftovers. But it turned out that he showed talent immediately. He was very bright. He spoke Russian, Hebrew, and Yiddish very well. And he wrote, and he became a teacher. And he was so good at it that the stepmother took notice of him for the first time. Also, he partially famous for having written in his own diary a little story called My Stepmother's Curses, in which he lists Yiddish curses alphabetically and translates them into Yiddish. And they're hilarious. But this stepmother found that list, and he thought, oh, he's really, really in trouble. But she thought it was so funny, she just was roaring with laughter instead. Yeah. And people read these curses all the time as entertainment because some of them are still used.
Can you give me an example? Can you say one in Yiddish?
Like defining go. You should only go to hell. Eat. You should eat worms. And on and on. After that, somehow she saw him in a more respectful light and treated him a little bit better. But he was able to get jobs teaching in schools at a very, very young age. And that was the way he met his wife, is that he was hired by this rich merchant to tutor the merchant's daughter. The girl's grandmother realized what was going on. These kids are going off into the woods together every day to study, and she alerted her parents, who fired him. And that was a terrible tragedy that they had to separate. And it was only years later that they finally did marry. And at that point, his father-in-law died, and he inherited the entire estate. And then he was able to do what he wanted. He could write what he wanted. He could publish what he wanted. He could publish the writers that he wanted to publish. And at that point, he asked the Jewish writers who were writing in Hebrew and Russian to write in Yiddish. And that really was almost the beginning of Yiddish literature.
Huh. So he gave birth to Yiddish literature.
In a way, he was one of several, yeah.
So he started out poor and he wound up rich, but he married into a wealthy family. And then I guess he lost it all at some point.
Well, he wasn't watching the stock exchange. Sound familiar? Yeah, for a while they were doing very well. They lived in this mansion in Kiev. It's still there. They moved into the big city, but with hard times and his being busy with publishing Yiddish writers and his own work, he kind of neglected it, and he was very naive, and he trusted too many people. So he wound up not quite poor, but he always had to struggle.
Calls to mind the famous line from Fiddler on the Roof, of course, if I were a rich man.
Oh, sure, what he would do.
And Fiddler on the Roof